Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for joining this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today we will talk about trade and climate, starting from the newly finished negotiations in Glasgow. And I am very honored to have two very qualified guests with me today. Jennifer A. Haverkamp, who is professor from practice at Michigan Law and also Graham Family Director at the University of Michigan Graham Sustainability Institute. And Professor Haverkamp has also worked in State Department as a special representative for environment and water issues, among many other things that she's done. And she has been a negotiator in many international contexts as well. And Carolyn Fischer is a professor of environmental economics at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and a Canada 150 research shareholder in climate, economics, innovation and policy at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and recently also a research manager for sustainability and infrastructure at the Development Research Group at the World Bank. So you can see that these are two very qualified ladies. A warm welcome to both of you.
Glad to be here.
Those of you in the audience, if you want to put question in the Q&A, we will take time for a few questions in the end. This summer, we saw a new global wave of forest fires, droughts, floods, etc. Many people died and the material damage was enormous. And in August, the IPCC report, the collection of scientific knowledge on climate change, presented its last conclusion. And it stated that the situation is indeed very serious, that heavy climate change and natural disasters risk to be the norm in the future, and that undoubtedly human emissions are the main cause behind the extreme weather. And as most of you know, this weekend, COP26 conference, a United Nations-led conference in Glasgow, just ended. And maybe a quick summary would be that the results were better than feared, but worse than hoped. And many things were discussed during this week. Of course, it keeps alive the idea that we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. There was some progress on decisions on deforestation, on reduction of methane emissions. India declared that it would be climate neutral in 2070, even if we don't really know how. There was a decision to double the financial contribution for climate adjusting until 2025 for the developing world. There would be updated national contributions for next year. There was a clarification on how you should report your climate work in the rule book. And for the first time, there was actually a mentioning of fossil fuels. Coal was mentioned for the first time, even if the conclusions were a bit watered out at the last moment. It was said that the world would phase down instead of phasing out, but still it's in the text, which many people consider as a progress. So in some 140 countries made commitments for net zero emission goals, but the question is, of course, how, and is this credible? So let's look a little bit at the results of this conference. How Jennifer and Carolyn, how do you judge this? Was it a success, the only possible outcome, a total failure? Starting with Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Cecilia, for that great summary of the COP. And I think I fall in the camp of good, not great. There was, so much urgency around what countries need to come forward and do. And the national commitments do not stack up yet to anywhere near where we need to be on that. So that's one of the biggest downsides. But you also have to look at it both in context and look at all the overall results. And when I say context, I mean that when you think about how to attack an urgent global problem like climate change, a multilateral agreement of almost 200 countries who have to reach decisions by consensus is not the best vehicle. It's going to be incremental, and it's going to reflect in some way the lowest common denominator of what countries are willing to agree to. And so it's the best we have for multilateral decisions, but it's not the best vehicle for leadership in the area. So in that context, I think the like you said, the fact that the fossil fuels and coal are in the decision document is very significant. The commitments that you iterated are all significant, but the real success, I think, of this COP is what happened outside of the agreement of almost 200 countries. And that was the agreements of subgroups, like you mentioned, around deforestation to, get to net zero deforestation by 2030 of quite a few countries, including some surprising members like Brazil. We'll see where they go with that. The other ones that you mentioned, methane is incredibly important to have front and center. Some people have said this will be known as the Methane Cop, and it's a short-lived climate pollutant which has to be addressed in the next decade to really help us stay on a track to 1.5 degrees of warming. So it's enormous that a group of countries came together and made commitments around that. I could go on, but I think how you judge this COP, you can't judge it in the week after it happened. You judge it a year from now, 5 years from now, as you see what countries have really done to implement and live up to the commitments that they made. You're muted.
You're muted, Cecilia.
Sorry, I never learn after 18 months on Zoom. Sorry, Carolyn, what's your take on this?
I agree. I thought both of you stated very well a summary of what happened at the COP. Yes, I think, as most COPs, it's progress, but it's not enough. But it is, it is an ongoing process. And so I think the important thing is that it sort of sets up, the countries all reiterated the ambition to, and this time even more clearly, not just to do 2 degrees and below, but really keep aim at 1.5 degrees. The specific commitments are not there yet. So the how that will be achieved is not there, and that comes afterwards, and that is an iterative process of each year coming back and trying to increase ambition. I think civil society actors, people like Greta Thunberg from your country, Cecilia, are disappointed that there weren't clearer commitments to specific actions, but it's still notable that these broader targets, that agreement among this many countries around these broader targets is still significant, and including the methane agreement, as Jennifer noted, is very important, and over 100 countries agreed to that. Of course, some important players did not, Russia, India, China, Venezuela, but some, big oil and gas producers did. So Canada, US, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So this is progress, and as the bigger players come together and continue to negotiate. So the Biden administration is continuing the dialogue with China. So these are the 2 biggest emitters in the world, also on how to address the climate crisis. So this is an ongoing process that, I would say it keeps hope alive, but, it isn't, with complete certainty. There's still a lot of work.
Could I add a little bit more to that?
Please.
Completely agree with what Carolyn said, but I think another way to step back and look at the significance of these COPs is under the rules of the international agreement, they happen every year. And so there's a buildup that I think is valuable for the global progress on climate change, because it's an annual spotlight on the need to address climate change. And I think especially triggered by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2018 report about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, and then also the report that came out in August, you have a huge ratcheting up of focus on climate change by actors other than these national governments. And so because these COPs are basically the global fair or the global international conference of everybody who cares about climate change, there's so many things that were happening on the sides, investment banks and finance companies coming together to say that they want to move toward net zero investment portfolios. All the states and cities and non-federal actors who came and were showcasing what they were doing. All the other non-governmental activities, the We're Still In, or the different coalitions coming together to use that to showcase what they're doing, is an incentive every year to make progress. And I think Glasgow was especially valuable for that.
And the fact that the countries agreed to a new, more precise way of reporting on the climate work, and that they would hand in their contributions on an annual basis instead of every 5 year, I think it was referred. Is that a good sign to put pressure for them to actually deliver?
Yes, because if you're saying the next decade is critical, you can't just check in at 5 years and then at 10 years. And also, we haven't yet mentioned, but a real accomplishment was the long-awaited completion of the rule book of the Paris Agreement, which is the finishing some of the transparency rules, and in particular, the rules around global carbon trading, what are called the Article 6 provisions.
You mentioned briefly the agreement between the US and China. There was more of a symbolic declaration that they would work together. But this is quite interesting, that these two countries who are not the best of friends always came together to say that we will work together on achieving the goals. It wasn't really precise, but it was a symbolic gesture that the world took note of.
So the U.S. and China have a track record of this. I mean, they know that these are the biggest emitters. Single country emitters in the world. And so addressing the climate challenge can't happen without them. And they also know that they have very strong leadership positions. So remember before the Paris COP, President Obama and she from China, just prior to the COP, they declared, commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that was really a catalyst for achieving stronger commitments from other countries at that COP. So I think they recognize that they have this ongoing responsibility and possibilities. There are also two technology powerhouses, developing clean energy technologies and producing them for the rest of the world as well. And so together with Europe and other major economies, I think a lot of the focus, continues to play out, not just at the COP, like you said, the annual trade fair, but also in the G7, the G20, so this is the G2. So Italy recently hosted the G20, and a lot of that focus was actually on climate and environment and sustainability. So I think we definitely have more focus in international diplomacy now, broadly speaking, on climate change because so many countries are really feeling the effects already, and this is just at 1 or 1.1 degree increase, and they're starting to realize that maybe we don't want to see a world with 2 degrees or more.
Yeah, I would just add that the US-China agreement is significant in part because all these countries are creeping toward greater ambition, but they're all looking to the left, looking to the right. What is everybody else doing? And so I think it was a real injection of confidence to the others that the US and China consider climate change such an important issue that they're transcending all their many severe differences in other policy areas to come together and have this agreement and announce it at the time they did in the COP. For others, and it's a good thing.
But now, of course, announcing beautiful goals is one thing. Then they have to be translated into concrete action. And sometimes that is painful legislation that has to go through and a lot of sacrifices, and we have energy prices and all that. But everybody needs to play their card. And trade wasn't really discussed, in that sense in Glasgow, but this is after all trade wins. So if we look a little bit about trade and how trade can contribute to climate, there is a huge pressure from civil society, from citizens, but also from companies and other stakeholders that trade cannot solve all the problems related to climate change and emissions, but it can play its part. And for quite some time now, I know in the EU, when I was trade commissioner, we always had sustainability chapters in our trade agreements, where we made reference to international conventions, Paris Agreement, the Convention on illegal logging and endangered species, and so on. And I know that the US and other partners have similar things as well. So how can trade more concretely contribute to achieving the climate goals? Carolyn, you want to start?
I think trade was a huge subtext of a lot of what was going on at COP26. So it's one of the reasons why getting some agreement, getting major emerging economies like China and India on board and talking is important. It also to enable countries like the United States to feel more secure in ramping up their ambition, because they are worried about trade exposed, emissions intensive trade exposed sectors. We also saw the US and the EU make an announcement that they're agreeing to cooperate on exploring how to use trade and potentially tariffs to address what they see both as overcapacity in steel, aluminum markets, but also to decarbonize them. So there's no detail that I could see on that, but I thought that was very interesting, because these are some of the same sectors that the EU is incorporating initially into its CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So these are important, very important sectors to try to decarbonize. But it's difficult to do so in a way that's truly that's unilateral, because these are products that are traded on global markets, and so it's difficult for for countries to do that on their own. So in the case of the EU, as you mentioned, so they've had an emissions trading system for many years now, and as they are ramping up their ambition in that trading system, prices are rising. They're getting more worried about carbon leakage, which would be if economic activity, emissions intensive economic activity moves to offshore to other countries that don't have the same levels of carbon pricing or regulation, but carbon pricing in particular. So the EU asks its companies to not only reduce their emissions, but any remaining emissions they have to pay for, in the sense that they have to surrender emission allowances. And right now, up till now, the EU has been fairly generous in giving these industries, leakage-prone industries, a lot of allowances for free. But that's something that they want to phase out. And so they're turning towards carbon border adjustment mechanism, basically asking imported goods to pay the same amount for their embodied emissions as EU industry does. So this is a way to try to level the playing field and ensure that EU consumers are facing consistent choices and recognizing the cost of the carbon embodied in steel, say, or aluminum, regardless if it's produced in the EU or outside the EU.
Yes, this is indeed a mechanism that was proposed this summer as part of the Green Deal package. and as you so rightly explained, a way to encourage other countries to move towards less dirty emission. And they have identified a group of particularly dirty industries like steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, and a few more, and to level the playing field. The US, Jennifer, has no pricing scheme on carbon like this, but I saw that Congress has proposed one to be efficient in 2 years, and that it would cover carbon-intensive goods exposed to trade competition, more or less the same goods, and that importers would then pay a carbon fee based on the costs that the US producers have calculated on some standard that would be determined by Treasury. So, and other countries are discussing similar things as well. So this is similar to the CBAM proposal by the EU, but a little bit different. Can these be combined in a way?
I think that would be very challenging. The EU's CBAM is designed effectively so that the tax or the price, the cost that European companies are having to pay is being reconciled at the border with imports. And it's a little bit apples and apples, not entirely, but somewhat. In the United States, if the US implemented a border adjustment measure without some sort of comprehensive climate legislation that put a price on carbon through a tax or through cap and trade or something like that, then they're trying to enter into what's a really complicated analysis of what is the cost of regulation and how do you know, our existing regulatory regime, what are the costs that the industry are bearing, you know, and how do you then try to reconcile or determine what equivalent measures are in other countries at the border. So my sense of that US legislation was it was to start the conversation. I think also it's a political reality that countries who want to pass ambitious climate legislation have to have some provision that their trade exposed, energy intensive industry and their labor unions, their workers see as recognizing the cost that they're bearing and the greater competition that they might be exposed to. So these provisions are very much also intended to avoid the leakage of emissions outside of one country to another, where you know you haven't eliminated the emissions, you've just moved them. And in some cases, there's a hope that they would also be an incentive for the countries of export to improve their own domestic policies as a way of leveling this playing field. But the politics around these are very complicated, and how you design them is complicated. I do think the EU made a great effort to design theirs in a way that's got an argument that it's WTO consistent. I think that this will probably still end up as a conversation in the WTO, so we'll see where that all goes. But I think there's a broader context right now, which is very interesting, which is with the increased focus and emphasis on the need to address climate change, how will the WTO as a body respond to that? And you know, one area to watch, I think, including for the ministerial coming up, is this group led by New Zealand and Costa Rica that's trying to put together a subgroup around trade and sustainability and climate change. And one of the things that they've been pushing is for the WTO to step in and also discipline fossil fuel subsidies in some way. And folks who follow the WTO know that we've had a 20-year negotiation on trying to discipline harmful fisheries subsidies. So, which may well be finally concluded this ministerial. So fingers crossed on that one. But I did think that, you know, there are $500 billion a year apparently in fossil fuel subsidies that are definitely making an unfair competition between fossil fuels and renewable energy. And the fact that these WTO members are taking to the WTO the conversation about fossil fuel subsidies. And then when you look at what came out of Glasgow, that almost 200 countries in their decision agreed on the importance of phasing down, getting rid of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And that term inefficient fossil fuel subsidies is the same one in the New Zealand document they're trying to get approved. So there you might see a synergy on that one. I want to pause, but I also would love to talk a little bit about deforestation at the right moment.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment, but not leaving fully the carbon issue yet, because you can design it in different ways. But the World Bank, OECD, IMF, and a lot of research institutes, they all say that taxing carbon is the most efficient way to really address emission issues. And ideally, of course, there should be a global tax looking at this, but we all know how difficult it is to come to global agreements. The OECD corporate tax took quite a lot of time, and we're still not fully there. And I think IMF, the boss of IMF, Mrs. Georgieva, she proposed some alternative, a carbon price floor with graduated pricings to accommodate different levels of development. And then there is this climate group proposed by the Nobel laureate William Nordhaus, a club of like-minded countries who would agree to harmonize emissions and set an international emission price for carbon, and non-members would then have to pay a tariff. So is any of this realistic to achieve, or should the EU continue to take the lead and to show the way and hope that others join? Because we don't want to create more global trade tensions, but something needs to be done, obviously. What's your take on that, Carolyn?
I mean, I think the EU has taken an important step forward in sort of pushing the global conversation about trade and climate. I mean, we've seen already a fairly modest CBAM developed explicitly to be as WTO compatible likely as possible, is sparking conversations and strategies in countries like Turkey and Russia are waking up to think about how who export a lot to the EU, how this might affect them and how they might respond for their industries. And then it's waking up a lot of other countries that would like to use trade measures. So, Canada, which is committed to a path towards quite high carbon pricing, they rely heavily on trade, especially with the US, but and need to think about how do you deal with large asymmetries in carbon pricing. So I think the IMF's leadership on a push towards a global minimum carbon price, even differentiated, part of the idea behind that is not only to spread the economics gospel that putting a price on carbon is one of the most efficient ways of reducing emissions, because it signals to everyone who uses carbon to an incentive to find a way to use less of it. So be that companies, be that makers of alternative products, substitutes that are lower carbon, they don't have a level playing field until the dirty goods have to pay their full weight. So that is one of the primary reasons that the EU is trying to get to more full carbon pricing, including the CBAM, and phasing out these kinds of subsidies. It's a difficult conversation because when you have then countries like the US that would be interested in using tariffs to protect their industries without combining that with a clear carbon price signal. I think that's very hard to justify, certainly legally, and also in the spirit of it. The carbon, border adjustment, we know a lot from every country that has a value added tax has border adjustments. So exports are relieved of the payments, and imports have to pay the tax. And so in a sense, this is a mechanism to try to get towards consumption-based carbon pricing. So consumers really have to pay the full price of carbon regardless of where the product originates. And that's that just doesn't work if you don't have a price on carbon. So I think the proposal, like in the Coons bill, would be not only difficult to implement, but I think it'd be nearly impossible to justify as being consistent with the obligations and responsibilities that we've agreed to in the WTO.
So that looks like a very difficult negotiations, obviously. I mean, the CBAM is still a proposal made by the Commission, and the quite complex legislative process in the European Union means that both the member states and the European Parliament has to agree on this, and they've only just started to look at it. So anyway, we're not going to find a solution from the EU in 1 year, 1.5, at least probably. And then lots of things can actually happen, depending also on what individual governments do, and maybe what comes out as a consequence of CBAM and the upcoming ministerial conference in WTO. In 2 weeks, ministers will meet again. It's not the same ministers this time, but 164 ministers engaged in trade will try to see how to reform WTO and what steps can be taken. And WTO has been for a long time in trouble. It's difficult to make decisions. The rules are outdated, and there's a lot of pending agreements that can't really be pushed through because there's too much resistance in certain. So there are lots of challenges there, of course, also in the whole health area. But something, and you mentioned the initiative by New Zealand and Costa Rica. And there are initiatives, and maybe if will not land to something very concrete, but at least some steps might be taken towards doing something on climate. There has been discussions on some statement and some proposals for a peace clause on this CBAM and similar initiatives, and whether the WTO should create a body to calculate the tax equivalent on domestic carbon restriction. I'm not sure the WTO is ready to embark on all these tasks yet, but maybe something can be done, because there is a lot of pressure also from consumers and citizens on this. What would be the best outcome of that scenario in end of December or mid-December?
So let me ponder a little bit your answer to the best, but I would like to add a couple thoughts. You talked about whether the WTO should be a place to calculate the embodied carbon tax. I do think there is increasing interest and rationale for there being some broadly understood methodologies and criteria for measuring embodied carbon, maybe even some general industry standards for certain types of products, what the desired goal is or what a floor ought to be. Because you're seeing more and more interest from consumers and from companies in what is the carbon content of their supply chain. So stepping aside for a moment from the trade rules, there are other commercial incentives developing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions along the whole production line. And if you had more common understanding of that, then not only would the border adjustment measures be easier to implement, but you would also have broader benefits through the private sector incentive process as well. So,
right. But I think it's important to make a distinction between I think common methodologies for calculated embodied carbon, which is I think very important regardless for be it for voluntary measures or for border adjustment measures. That's, so calculating the carbon footprint of products versus trying to calculate the, the cost, the effective marginal cost of non-market approaches to regulation. I think that's very difficult and it will be hard to do in a transparent way. And ultimately, what border adjustments do, or they're asking, importers to pay for their embodied carbon in the same way that domestic firms have to pay for their embodied carbon. They're not adjusting for the costs, the direct costs of the regulation. They're adjusting for the indirect costs of being, liable to pay for those remaining embodied emissions.
True. One reason I brought up the embodied carbon question as well is that it seems to me that we might be on the brink of another big debate globally around eco-labeling and trade. And that was a very big debate in the 90s, where the European Union was considering whether to do something mandatory. And that, I think, labeling may well be something that countries are also starting to use as a tool again. So these issues may well come back to us. And one reason I raise that is in this context of deforestation. We talked about how at Glasgow there was an agreement among many countries to set this deforestation, net zero deforestation by 2030 target. I believe today the EU is supposed to come out with some regulations around limiting imports of.
It came this morning.
It did come out this morning. Great.
Yes.
So I was looking for it this morning. Yeah, I was looking for it and I haven't seen it yet. But if you've read it, I would love maybe, Cecilia, for you to tell the audience about it, because that is, that's a very interesting new potential tool that the EU is rolling out to test, which is, products that are, products that are produced through deforestation. In other words, the land was converted after 2020, would be access to the European market would be restricted. And I don't know the details of it yet, but I think that's going to raise a whole host of interesting WTO questions.
Indeed, I haven't read the whole document, but there was an announcement by the Commission today to actually ban imports of certain goods that are made, that cause deforestation.
Right.
I think it was coffee, cacao, some timber, etc. And then, of course, there will always be a discussion. Rubber is not in, but immediately some came out to say rubber should be in. So this is the first proposal, and it will be discussed with member states and with the European Parliament. But you're absolutely right. There was a list to ban import from certain products in order to protect the forests, so to say.
A lot of commodities. And I think there's another provision that is similar to what's called the Lacey Act in the United States, which is also to prohibit imports of products that are grown or harvested inconsistent with the domestic laws of the country that they're from. But this goes farther, it seems to me, in that regard. There's a provision that came into the free trade agreement between Switzerland and its trading partners and Indonesia last year, where it was targeted at palm oil and said that the reduced tariff benefits of the FTA for vegetable oils are only given to those that are raised sustainably. And so there are a lot of interesting questions around who defines sustainability, but I think that was the first example of using in an FTA a tariff reduction to try to distinguish between sustainable products and non-sustainable products quite that way. And I talk so much about deforestation because it's also really essential to climate change. So much of the carbon in the world is being held right now in the forests that if we don't stop deforestation, we're not going to get to 1.5 degrees.
Indeed. And that's why it's important that at least some steps forward were made at Glasgow as well on this issue. Now, of course, we need to see exactly the content of this proposal that came this morning from Brussels, because, of course, lots of countries will claim that this is discriminatory and not WTO compliant, etc. So more will follow on that. Sorry, Carolyn, did you want to come in on that?
I think that, so that raises really interesting questions. I guess if you have it embodied in a free trade agreement, then the parties are agreeing to having these differentiated tariffs. And so the question is for something, so like Nordhaus's works inspired a kind of climate club, so can countries outside of the club haven't agreed to have tariffs imposed on them for not being part of the club. So, so for example, we had the Montreal Protocol, which was very successful for phasing out ozone depleting substances, and part of that was an agreement, was a trade ban on many of these substances as enforcement mechanisms, and that was part of that agreement. But given that we haven't seen trade or trade bans or border adjustments really come up in the COP negotiations, so it's a question of whether countries can band together and agree on and implement sort of trade sanctions to non-members that are all non-members to the club, but that are party to the UNFCCC process. So I'd be interested to hear, from a legal perspective, what ideas would be, there beyond the kind of, if these countries all agree to common carbon pricing, and then a border adjustment, a WTO compatible border adjustment system.
That's a little bit the thought behind the proposal on the climate club, right? Non-members would be punished by some sort of punitive tariff.
And that's very distinct from border adjustments.
And I think that the US-EU announced plan with respect to aluminum and steel is an experiment in climate clubs, because the US announcement says that it will be open to other countries. And so they're hoping to build it out to a group. So I think it's a really interesting piece to watch.
Yes, and we need to see more details on this, obviously, as well. There are quite a lot of questions coming in here. Let's see. One goes back to the sanction issues. Someone who says, can we use trade as a carrot and stick? EU sanctions to force change or reward good economies with more trade or lower tariffs or preferential access? Would WTO rules need to change to make that happen? Well, that is linked to the preferential treatment that the EU has in some trade agreements, especially with the developing countries, to give greater access if they fulfill a list of United Nations conventions. And this is, of course, the eternal debate. How do you reward? How do you punish? How do you actually enforce these things? Do you have any views on that?
Well, I think it can be difficult to use lower tariffs as incentives in a lot of situations. The Switzerland-Indonesia example maybe being separate, because an awful lot of trade is now, tariff rates are now being set through bilateral and regional free trade agreements, where the overall objective of those agreements is to go to zero in as many sectors as possible. And in a lot of other areas, the tariffs are already pretty low. And so there isn't, I don't think, a lot of play in the joints there for using tariffs as a terribly effective positive incentive, though that will vary by product, I'm sure, and by country and what their tariff levels are. What do you think, Carolyn?
I think, in part that, as you're saying, the WTO hasn't made a lot of progress in the past couple of decades. It's a bit bogged down, and and the dispute settlement process takes a long time as well. And so we've seen that countries can use or abuse that and get away with WTO incompatible measures, at least for several years before anything happens. So I think there's leeway to try something and then see what happens in the dispute settlement process. But I think the WTO has been weakened lately. So we haven't seen, well, with the change in U.S. administration, we may see, we're seeing a bit more return to sort of international, following international norms, but the WTO process may not be as big a barrier as it once was. I think the WTO negotiators do need to step up their game and show that they can come to. They've been talking about green goods and services for a long time too. So making some progress there would help demonstrate the relevance of the WTO and trade in improving towards sustainability and sustainable growth, and demonstrating their relevance also in the climate conversation. Before, I think these are things that have to be discussed together, and I worry that keeping on separate tracks is going to lead to more conflict.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about these different kinds of subsidies. Another conundrum that the WTO has had for decades is reducing agricultural subsidies. And land use, agriculture, how much food gets wasted, production of food in places that ought not to be grown, is also a real contributor to climate change. And so there are lots of aspects of where the WTO's work that have impacts on climate change.
Well, I think all efforts are being done to try to see what is realistic to achieve at the ministerial, and what can you at least start to process. And of course, the fact that there is no functional appellate body also makes it difficult for all those who claim that this is WTO compatible. This is not, we will sue you at WTO. Well, there's no appellate body. So this is actually something that really needs to be addressed as well. There's actually a question on this here saying, could you please define what is an inefficient as opposed to an efficient subsidy? Well, that's a whole science, I think. Anybody wants to give it a try? We'll come back to, we'll actually have.
Well, I would say just from the pure economics, I doubt this is what the trade lawyers might be talking about. From a pure economics perspective, an efficient subsidy would be a subsidy that corrects some other problem in the market. A lot of people would argue. So in the absence of carbon pricing, for example, using subsidies to renewable energy can improve efficiency, because fossil fuels aren't paying their full social costs. But in general, it's the polluter pays principle is an important principle. So saying that it's really the polluters that should be paying for the cost, the burden of their emissions, and then you shouldn't need so many subsidies to try to correct the incentives and level the playing field.
The debate also distinguishes sometimes often between production subsidies and consumption subsidies. And, it can be inefficient if you're putting forward subsidies to, send the wrong market signals around what it costs to produce the good. Whereas, consumption subsidies can help people at the lower end of the economic ladder be able to afford heating or gasoline or things like that, if you're subsidizing the consumer as opposed to subsidizing the production.
What's interesting in the WTO is that there are, for all the limitations and rules about tariffs, there are exceptions for conserving natural resources and the environment and human health, et cetera. So these exceptions can be used in designing a border carbon adjustment mechanism. However, there are no comparable exceptions for subsidies. And I think this is a really big issue when we're thinking about the global transformation that we really need to make. And, in some sense, so from a trade perspective, we don't like to subsidize producers because that's unfair competition. And there's certainly been, trade tensions, say with China over subsidies to solar panels. But from a global perspective, producer subsidies do lower the cost of these and make it easier for countries around the world, and especially developing countries to adopt these technologies. So I think there needs to be a conversation about what kinds of programs to subsidize low carbon technologies and encourage their dissemination globally are in fact appropriate.
This is indeed a hugely important question. I mean, it will be discussed at WTO, fishery subsidies, agricultural subsidies, probably not, but maybe a process, and all member countries are discussing that in their home countries as well. We might come back to that at another trade wind episode. There is a question also on deforestation. Is restriction on deforestation leading to trade getting shifted to imports rather than local production, and also firms and government hiding deforestation policies leading to greenwashing? Well, that's an interesting question. You want to have a go at that, Jennifer?
Let's see. Well, I think maybe what's interesting is, again, this measure that the EU just floated today is an effort to counter that, right? Which is that it's not just countries agreeing to eliminate deforestation in their own territory, but measures like the EU's are saying we are also going to close our market to products produced from deforestation. So that would address some of the leakage that might otherwise happen of shifting production from countries who are part of the commitment to countries that aren't part of the commitment. I think the bigger challenge around deforestation and commitments to reduce deforestation is in that we don't have a great track record of countries meeting those target dates and commitments in the past. I think that one of the Sustainable Development Goals had a deforestation target. I think that there was a UN agreement on forests that came out of New York some years ago that had a deforestation target. And the one that came out of Glasgow, and my understanding is moving that down the road a little farther. So there could be greenwash concerns, but there are also just around deforestation, enormous monitoring and, ways of testing whether countries are meeting those obligations. Satellites are completely changing that story, but historically that's been hard too. So there is a potential for greenwash. It's very hard through that whole supply chain to keep track of forest products from.
Indeed. Yeah, well, the greenwashing is a general emerging problem on this, and that relates to what you both have said on green labeling, on green investment. What is a green investment? Subsidies, a green subsidy, because of course there is always this risk of greenwashing. So a very complex issue indeed. We are approaching the end of this. Maybe you have some final words on what's happening now. How do you see what is the most urgent thing to do now after the COP26 and related to trade? What can we realistically expect the coming year leading to the next COP?
Sure.
Difficult.
I mean, I would expect, more of the same sort of ongoing dialogue and sort of incremental improvements in ambition. What we need is really a much stronger breakthrough, and in terms of not just agreements on targets, but clear commitments to actual actions, to policy actions, to see how countries will sort of implement their path to decarbonization. And so I think as those come out, they can be better evaluated, and there will be sort of ongoing iterations of pressure to then ratchet those commitments.
I would agree with that. I would say between now and next year, countries really need to come forward with stronger targets as well. And it may well be that a useful function of the WTO would be to encourage more and more reporting to the WTO of national measures that are being implemented to help meet their NDCs, so that the conversations, the questions around implementation, around possible trade impacts of these various measures can be aired constructively and early.
Yeah, well, very interesting times indeed. Carolyn Fischer, Jennifer Haverkamp, thank you so much for taking time to answer a few of the questions. Of course, all this is related, and we only touched a little fragment of this very complex issue of climate, trade, sustainability. There will certainly be occasions to come back to that, but thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Thank you to the audience. And next Trade Winds actually will be held just after the the WTO ministerial in Geneva. So we will analyze the results with no other than Annabel Gonzalez and others known to Trade Winds watchers. And you're welcome back at that occasion. So thank you very much. Have an excellent day.
Thank you very much.